Okay, and we're letting everybody in. It'll just be about another minute as everybody comes in. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sari. I'm the Director of Public Programs at MOFAD. This is a really exciting evening. We're so happy to have Sandor Katz and Arielle Johnson with us tonight. Maybe some of you have been to MOFAD events before. Maybe this is your first time because you're like super into fermentation. Either way, we're so happy that you're here. There's going to be a lot of interesting conversation that happens tonight. For those of you who have not been to a virtual event with us before, we appreciate it. We are a museum. We're the Museum of Food and Drink. We're based in New York City, but since COVID hit, we have pushed everything to the internet, like all major cultural institutions. So we have been very excited to have virtual events, still find ways to come together, have these fantastic conversations. And the nice thing about Zoom is that we've been able to connect with so many of you coming from all different places, literally all over the world sometimes. So it's just been a really meaningful and gratifying experience, and certainly a silver lining in this most difficult of times. Also, with an upcoming election, we just appreciate you taking some time to kind of check out of all of that and be with us. And just as a reminder, if you have not, please, please, please vote. Absolutely encourage you to vote in person if possible. If you have requested a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot, definitely if you are able to deliver it in person as opposed to putting it in the mail, because it sounds like there's really some challenges with getting your vote counted. So thank you so much for listening to my little spiel on that. A couple things about Zoom. We are recording this evening. This is because we like to be able to offer the programs virtually once the program is over. So that's another reason why we ask you just to keep your cameras off, your microphones off, so there's no real distractions that happen during the conversation. There will be a Q&A at the end of the program. You'll be able to use the chat box for that. Right now, the chat box is closed just so the panelists can kind of focus without any like messages popping up. But I'll let you know at the end of the program when it's open and you can start typing your questions for Sandor and Arielle right there. Just one more thing, if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, I will send you an email tomorrow bugging you to do that, because it's really the best way to find out about all of our programs, and we have so many things going on, so we don't want you to miss anything. So I'm gonna shut up. I'm gonna have Sandor first introduce himself, if you would. Sandor.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and for organizing this event. I've been calling myself a fermentation revivalist. I got interested and excited and obsessed with fermentation beginning maybe about 27 years ago. I've experimented widely, mostly self-taught and from books. And I'm the author of several books, Wild Fermentation, which came out in 2003 and was revised in 2016. The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, which was published in 2006. The Art of Fermentation, which came out in 2012, and my new book, which we'll be talking about today, which is Fermentation as Metaphor. I teach widely these days online, but I love to talk to people about fermentation.
Thank you, Sandor. You're truly the OG of fermentation. So we are super excited and honored to have you tonight. Like, seriously, I'm a little bit geeking out. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Arielle, and I'll be back at the end for Q&A. So just a reminder to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off for now, and we'll see you at the end of the program.
Thanks, Sari. I guess I introduce myself now. I'm Arielle Johnson. I am my formal training is in flavor chemistry. I got my doctorate at UC Davis in the Department of Viticulture and Enology. But my sort of focus is food, flavor, science, gastronomy, how we can like combine those things together to learn things and learn new knowledge and apply it. My first job out of grad school, I went to Copenhagen restaurant Noma, where I co-founded the fermentation lab there. And while we were like developing things in the lab, and even before that, Sandor, your books were some of the only ones besides a couple of academic texts that like existed and that we could reference. So you definitely had a role in that genesis, as well as speaking at the MAD Symposium in 2013. So you have a literal intersection with NOMA as well. So after that, I was doing some flavor and fermentation of plant research at MIT. And now I'm currently writing a book about flavor, and I'm also the science officer on the TV show Good Eats. So I'm super, super psyched to be doing this with you and with you guys all tonight. I think one thing, just in case somehow there are people tuning in that are not so familiar with fermentation. I mean, so the book deals with fermentation as metaphor. Sandor, would you like to talk about fermentation as literality?
Yes. Yes. No. I mean, certainly. Literal fermentation. Has been my my central focus. When we're talking about fermentation, broadly speaking, we're talking about the transformative action of microorganisms. If you're talking to a biologist, they might have a different understanding that fermentation is anaerobic metabolism. And indeed, the vast majority of processes that we would describe as fermentation are anaerobic. They do not require, they involve organisms that don't require oxygen, but there are a large handful of processes that have become understood to be part of fermentation that involve aerobic organisms. So, I would say that any, transformative action of microorganisms would qualify as a fermentation process.
What are some of the fermentation all-stars that maybe people don't think of immediately? Like, I sometimes remind people that wine is fermented.
Sure.
They say they don't know about fermentation.
My life has been so full of these people who I meet. They hear what I do and they make a face, I say fermentation, they think kimchi. And by the way, I love kimchi.
Oh yeah.
But
Delicious.
Kimchi is not the poster child for all fermentation. And and then people tell me, oh, I don't like fermented foods. And then I'm like, oh, poor you. You don't eat bread, you don't eat cheese, you don't drink coffee, you don't eat chocolate. I mean, such a, huge range of everyday foods that, that people eat all the time are products of fermentation. And I would say that, the individual who is not eating and drinking products of fermentation every day is the exception and not the rule.
I think that's probably true. But since you started teaching, has literacy around that changed or become more literate?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say it was always evident to me that there were a lot of people around who had an interest in fermented foods and beverages, and it sort of represented a realm of our everyday lives which is mysterious to people, which they don't understand. They, a lot of people, project all the anxiety we've been taught to have about bacteria onto the idea of fermentation, and then, so they shred some cabbage and pack it into a vessel, and and then they're staring at the vessel thinking, how do I know that I have good bacteria growing in here and not some dangerous bacteria that might, make my family sick or even kill somebody. So, I mean, I feel like so much of my work has just been trying to calm people's anxiety about this and assure them that these foods have withstood the test of time because they're so reliably safe. And that, this is not rocket science. You don't need an exact formula. That, this is artistry like any other realm of cooking. But yeah, no, I mean, definitely there's growing interest in fermentation. And, I would say my analysis of it is that there are two primary reasons why there is growing interest in and attention to the phenomenon of fermentation. Number one, the microbiome. You know, up until the Human Microbiome Project, you know, most people were just thinking of bacteria as something dangerous to be avoided.
Right.
And I think that began to put in, you know, in the general consciousness, the idea that bacteria are important to us, and that, you know, each of us is, you know, walking around with this incredibly complex community of organisms that, you know, support our effective functioning. And
there's there's like vastly more bacterial cells in your body if you're healthy than human cells. Yeah.
So, I mean, people became more and more aware of this, and more aware of the importance of biodiversity in the gut. And I think people started seeking out these like live probiotic foods. You know, the other reason I would say is that, like, you know, during the 20th century, all aspects of food production really like disappeared from people's lives. You know, whether it's like, you know, the garden or basic processes of transformation, how we turn the products of agriculture into the foods and drinks we enjoy, and everything became sort of mysterious, and production became centralized. And, you know, for people of like, you know, my grandmother's generation and my mother's generation, you know, that represented a certain amount of liberation. But I would say that, you know, by around the turn of the millennium, you know, people started asking questions about their food. You know, how was this produced? You know, by what methods was this grown? What are the ingredients in here? And people, you know, started critiquing this system and wanting to interrogate their food. And when you start interrogating your food, fermentation is part of the answer.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of I don't know, kind of like the larger project of modernization and like modernity as an ideal. You know, where we think of something being modern as being like good and advanced, or maybe that's like the initial association we're supposed to have. But you know, if you look at all different types of modernization processes, whether it's like city planning or agriculture or maps even, they always involve simplification, like simplify what's really there. They're about making things like easy and legible for like a centralized person or authority to understand. And they're also about like being able to directly manipulate things, which is all kind of, or not even kind of, quite literally the opposite of what you're doing when you're doing a wild fermentation.
Well, I mean, except that it's simple. The story of how you actually do it, like, right. People can't believe how simple it is.
True.
You know, people just like project all of this complexity upon it, and, you know, just in fact, you know, the organisms that we need are generally on the substrate that we're fermenting. And, you know, most traditional fermentation processes are just incredibly straightforward and simple. I mean, not in every case, but you know, in the majority of cases, I would say that that's true.
Yeah. Well, I think if they weren't simple to do, like if like basic fermentation were like much harder than, you know, keeping your hands clean and squishing the vegetables and adding salt, then like it wouldn't have caught on the way that it did in so many places.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, so like, yes, I totally agree with you. It is very simple, but then like you compare like, or what we know now from microbiology of like what's going on with like microbial ecology and like, you know, which species of lactic acid bacteria is dominating at any one time, what kinds of things they hand off to their other friends so that they can become ascendant. If you compare that to like a sterilized and then inoculated industrial fermentation, it's way more complex.
Well, sure. I mean, the dynamics of it are complex. I mean, microbiology is enabling us to understand the incredible complexity of the interaction among all of these different organisms and their transformation of nutrients. But, you know, none of the people who sort of figured out the fermentation processes we're doing, you know, sort of had microbiology to teach them. You know, they were just, you know, they were just, you know, figuring out that, well, okay, if we if we manipulate the environment in this way, then this is the likely outcome.
Right.
And so, it's fascinating that we're learning about, these elaborate communities and their, very complex interactions. But, that's not the knowledge that, anyone has ever needed in
Right.
order to, do these processes.
Well, yeah, I mean, unless you're actively, genetic sequencing a fermentation, it's also not something that anyone interacts with directly. Like even if you know what species are happening at what time, like you infer that from what is happening in the fermentation, whether it's bubbling or like what sort of acidity there is. Like you can only look at the kind of like macro synergistic effects.
But like all of these amazing cheeses have been made for hundreds of years, and I love the work that microbiologists are doing, studying the microbiology and the microbial ecology of cheese rinds. But like the people who figured out the processes, like they didn't know that, they didn't need that, and the people who are interested in it now, they don't need it. I'm so happy that there are investigators who are like pondering these basic questions and trying to understand the processes better. But, I feel like I spend so much of my time explaining to people, like, you don't need a laboratory, you don't need a microscope, you don't need a sterile environment to do these things. And, your kitchen already is more, high tech than, all the people who were making sauerkraut for thousands of years.
That's true. The oven is an insanely complicated piece of technology to a 17th century person. Well, so, it sounds like one metaphor that fermentation is then, or two would be like intuition and trust. Perhaps.
Well, sure. Intuition and trust, but also, most people are not intuiting how to do these things. Like they're, in a traditional context, like they're learning from their mother and their grandmother how to do it. And they're doing the same thing. But yeah, I think once you understand the process, the environmental manipulation that you're trying to accomplish, well, then, that's when the creative play aspect, kicks in, because, once you understand that, like, your objective is to get your vegetables submerged under liquid, then, oh, well, I could try all these different vegetables. Oh, what seasonings could I use? Oh, how is it different if I use a 0.5% salt compared to a 1% salt? You can, once you understand, what you're trying to do with it, what your objective is, then everything opens up, and you can replace one grain for another grain, and you can really mix it up, and that's all the incredible innovation that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, that definitely, to my experience, talking to and working with a lot of cooks that are like very interested in like understanding the basics so that they can be applied to other things. Well, so like when you teach classes, do you do a lot of stuff with like mostly beginners, or is like at the point now where there's enough people really familiar that you can kind of go more masterclass-y?
I teach in a variety of settings. I do a lot of everything's been a little bit different these past months because I haven't gone anywhere, and I've just been like, talking into my computer like this. But I like communicating like fundamental concepts to people. So I continue to teach beginners and people with a very casual interest. And then I also for like 10, 12 years now, I've been doing these like residency programs, short term, like, 5 days, where it's just like we ferment all kinds of things. We make some koji, we make some miso, we make some shiokoji, we make some tempeh, we make various fermented vegetable concoctions, we make some kind of alcohol, we make some lightly fermented beverages, we make some yogurt. So, it's just trying to get a little bit of experience with a lot of different kinds of ferments, and just encourage people's creativity. And then, we cook meals together and use the things that we're fermenting in the meals. So, I like both. You know, I love talking to people about fermentation, and I also love just trying to be really clear about the, you know, the concepts. And so, I mean, I don't get tired of talking about the basics to people. I don't have a preference for talking about, you know, more nuanced, complicated processes as compared to the, you know, ones that I would consider to be simpler and more straightforward.
Yeah. Am I correct in thinking that you might have some show and tell items?
Oh, I've always got show and tell. Yeah, sure. Well, okay. I mean, here, I wonder how well I can. Let me just grab a. So if I change the angle, oh yes, okay.
Oh, nice.
So this is sake.
Oh, awesome.
So this is sake that really just started fermenting yesterday. And this is like a really simple old sake process. I learned about it from the master brewer at this Japanese brewery called Terada Honke. And,
very cool.
And this is called the Bodai Modo method. And I mean, basically what I do is I start with 3 pounds of rice. 1 pound, I put in raw. 1 pound, I cook and put it in the water cooked. And the raw is in a little mesh bag. Then for like 3 or 4 days, it's just the cooked rice and the raw rice. And that's the starter. That's the moto.
Oh, so it's almost like a rice sourdough.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and you know, sake always starts with this sort of lactic and yeast starter. So, you know, the organisms are coming from the raw rice, the nutrients are coming from the cooked rice, and then meanwhile, I make koji with the 3rd pound of rice. And then by the time the koji is ready, the water is bubbling. And then you take out the raw rice, cook it, and then cool that down, mix the newly cooked rice with the koji, and then add that to the water with the original cooked rice. And then it just takes right off. Right now, it's very sweet. You know, just opening it up, I could smell how sweet it is. So the first process is basically the koji, the enzymes of the koji breaking down the complex carbohydrates of the rice into simple sugars. And then you also have the yeast that have been developing there, and then they are fermenting the sugars into ethanol, alcohol. So that's one fun thing that I'm doing. Another one that I have right here is this is ticha de jora. So this is jora is the Spanish word for malt. So like you know, sprouted grain, sprouted corn. So this is like I cooked a little bit of sprouted corn, and then I cooled it off and I mixed it with all this fruit, and now it's nice and bubbly. And this is a style that I learned from some people in Ecuador.
Oh, okay.
And right now, the reason I'm sort of doing, I mean, I like to do these things just for fun. Yeah. But the specific reason why I'm doing them right now is, you know, although I do have this book that's just coming out, for the last few months, I've been working on sort of a fermentation travelogue book. So
very cool.
You know, sort of reviewing like, you know, places that I've gone and, you know, notes that I took and correspondences that I had, and just trying to present, you know, a sort of impressionistic range of foods and beverages that I haven't written about before, that I've learned about how to make.
Oh, very cool.
So I'm doing some sort of, you know, recipe development kind of stuff. I have one other really fun thing to show. I mean, I have actually quite a few other things. You know, we could go on all night about it, but I'm sure a lot of people here have heard of natto. Probably a lot of people have tried natto. I mean, I really have come to, I mean, I did not start off loving natto, but I have come to really, really enjoy the flavor and the texture of natto. But when I traveled a few years ago, in southwestern China, and I visited this little village in Guizhou called Qinfen with my friend Mara Jane King. and her mother, who was friends with people in that village. But we visited this village at the end of November to learn about fermentation there. And one of the things that they were feeding us was these little cakes that we realized were made from natto and spices. And then they would pulverize them and mix them with soy sauce and or vinegar and make a little dipping sauce out of it. But what I've been doing is dehydrating natto, grinding it up with sesame seeds, salt, and other spices. So like this powder, you can see this mostly empty jar. The rest of it is in, my belly and the bellies of my people who I live with and people who've eaten with us. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, this has just become my favorite table condiment. And some of my friends who have not been able to, develop a taste for natto actually love this. And sort of like with fish sauce, with fermented tofu, with a lot of the kind of stronger flavors of fermentation, sometimes like a little bit creates this sort of like, complexity and depth and je ne sais quoi, whereas a lot of it has a pronounced flavor. So sometimes less is more. And, I'm loving this sort of natto-based condiment idea, and I've made like 5 other flavors, and I have a whole, I have a tray of the different like natto condiments that I've been using.
Awesome. Hopefully some good show and tell or actually show and taste options when we're not undergoing a plague, I guess. But okay, so having talked about some cool fermentations and processes and recipes, there's actually none of that in this book. This book is focused just on ideas about fermentation or ideas relating to fermentation. I'm really curious what the genesis of that was for you.
Well, I mean, I would say that I have always had an interest in broadening the context for talking about food and for talking about fermentation. And, sometimes that's just like, okay, people get interested in fermentation for a variety of reasons. So, I meet a certain number of people who are interested in the promise of probiotics or some other health aspect of fermented foods. And I've had people many times say to me, I don't care what it tastes like. I just want I just want to get the benefits from it. And then I'm always challenging them on that. I'm saying like, of course it matters what it tastes like, because if you don't like it, if your partner, if your kids don't like it, they're not going to eat it. They're not going to get these health benefits if they don't put it in their mouth, and they're not going to put it in their mouth if they don't like it. So like, of course, if you're interested in foods that are going to make you healthier, you also have to be interested in how they taste. And conversely, I've met chefs who are like, I'm interested in flavor. I don't care at all about the purported health benefits of it. And I'm like, well, it's like, I like good food too. I like food that tastes good, but I also like food that makes me feel good. And, obviously food has an effect on our well-being, and, why not consider that also? But anyway, I mean, I think that food also relates to a lot of issues that are bigger than food. They relate to, our health and well-being. They relate to culture. They relate to economics. They relate to power. They relate to who controls land. They relate to government policies for agriculture and for trade and for importation. And it just so happens that in the English language, I didn't make this up, but people use fermentation in a metaphorical way all the time. And, when I first started getting interested in fermentation and obsessed with fermentation, it felt like every time I picked up a magazine and read an article, I'd see some reference to, cultural fermentation, political fermentation, spiritual fermentation. So I just got interested in the ways that we're using this word in English to describe any bubbly phenomenon. I mean, really, the reason why our word in English has such expansive metaphorical possibilities is that fermentation was not clearly understood in the past. And so, the word fermentation comes from Latin fervere, which means to boil. And it's because, the visible action of fermentation in liquids was bubbles, just like the visible action of boiling in liquids. And so, we began to just talk about any kind of like bubbly excitement as a form of fermentation. And, I just find this, very, very interesting. And I've referred to it in each of my earlier books and in passing ways. And I just had the idea that, it would be fun and interesting to, try to reflect more deeply about metaphorical ideas of fermentation. And then I decided to sort of like add in some related concepts. Like I feel like, almost everyone who's never practiced fermentation before has some anxiety about contamination,
right,
and some, sort of ideas that they're projecting onto it about purity. People are always, shocked and sometimes horrified that, I'm not doing any specific, sterilization routine to the crocks and the jars that I'm fermenting things in. And, I think hot water and soap is absolutely adequate for most applications. And so, I got interested in these concepts of purity, which I actually consider to be, an impossible state, and contamination, which I think of as an inevitable state. But then also how these concepts, influence our ideologies. And so, I just decided to, this book is very like kind of impressionistic. Some might say it's all over the place. I'm trying to like, connect some dots. I just think, I'm very, very much interested in food, but I don't think food is everything.
Yeah. Well, I there's a lot that I thought was like very timely in a lot of the sections. I really, I guess, vibed with the way you connected like microbial purity to like the political weapons of purity, and like the idea of like perfect boundaries, and all of these sort of like fallacious concepts.
Well, thank you. I'm glad that resonated for you. I just was distracted by a note from Sari, who asked if we could see some of the images. So
so there's amazing.
The book is full of all of this microscopy,
scanning electron microscope stuff.
So here I am in a field of doubanjiang, which is this Sichuanese fermented paste of like fava beans and chilies. Here I am in a field of calm yeast. Now, I'll bet many people who have made some sauerkraut or other fermented vegetables have, come back to their jars and crocks and found a, like a little layer on the top, a little aerobic growth. This is calm yeast. This is very, a common sight on the surfaces of.
I have one right over there, actually.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
And then also just, it's not only the intentional ferments that are beautiful. This is a piece of cornbread that sat a few days too long in my kitchen waiting to be eaten. It grew all of these different color crazy molds. So along with this essay about fermentation as metaphor, the book also includes all of these microscopy images, some of which I did with my setup that I have at home, a stereoscope that connects into my computer, which is great for photographing the fungal structures, but not quite strong enough to really make much of the bacteria.
So I was fungi are quite larger.
Yeah, the fungi are generally larger. And so I was able to team up with a local university, Middle Tennessee State University, and I showed up with boxes and bags and like 40 samples, and got all of these scanning electron microscope images. But of course, if you're not using light, you don't have color. So the scanning electron microscope images are all in black and white, and so we've colorized them. For visual interest and excitement.
No, it's a really like lovely thing to look at while you're reading it, almost like a wall scroll or something like that. One concept I was like particularly I guess attracted to that I feel like not a lot of people have heard about literally, but might resonate are these concepts of microbiopolitics and the post-Pasteurian approach.
Sure. So
do you want to talk about that some?
Yeah, I mean, these are both concepts that come from this MIT anthropologist, Heather Paxson, who does a lot of work, studying the culture of cheesemaking and the ideas of cheesemaking. And, basically her idea is that the Pasteurian worldview would really be like industrial cheesemaking, and the idea that you pasteurize the milk, you kill everything, you start with a blank slate, and then you very carefully introduce starter cultures, which are, sort of isolated, pure cultures that generally have been propagated in a laboratory. And, you can go to, there's all these websites, cheesemaking.com and others, where, you can choose an extraordinary range of pure cultures. But, the pure cultures didn't exist before the 20th century. They are really inventions of microbiology, and all the traditional cheeses involve, communities of organisms generally that are found in the milk itself, or, in some cases in the aging environment, or some interaction between the aging environment and what was in the milk in the first place. And so, what she's calling the post-Pasteurian idea would be, people conceiving of themselves rather than, conquering nature, working with nature, working with biodiversity, rather than feeling like biodiversity, needs to be defeated in order to make cheese. And I would definitely identify myself in the post-Pasteurian camp. And people ask me a lot about starter cultures, and I would say that my basic analysis is, in any realm of fermentation, people have isolated cultures, and you can use starter cultures. But in every realm, if we're talking about cheese, if we're talking about salami, if we're talking about beer, if we're talking about bread, if we're talking about wine, like the most outstanding examples are made with wild fermentation, with the community of organisms that is found in the substrate or in the environment, but that it's easier. Like anyone who's ever made sourdough bread, it's easier and faster to make bread with a packet of yeast. But if you take the time to work with the sourdough and develop some technique for that, it'll take you a little bit more time, but your bread will have more flavor, it'll have more accessible nutrients, it'll last longer. So, everything about it is superior, except that it takes a little bit more time and it's harder.
But you're rewarded in this harder work and this post-Pasteurian philosophy by much better flavor.
Exactly. And then what you realize once you do it a little bit is it doesn't take that much longer.
Right. Have you are you familiar at all with the bread lab at Washington State University?
Yes. a little bit.
Oh, sorry, go on.
It happens that my partner is from Pullman, Washington, where Washington University is. I have not made it out there to the bread lab, but one of these visits I hope to.
Yeah, it's very cool. Well, and to explain to those who don't know, the bread lab was started by Professor Steve Jones at Washington State University trained as a like super old school wheat breeder, and probably, I don't know, 10 years ago decided to start breeding grains for flavor, like specifically like high yielding mixed culture grains for flavor, which no one was doing. But the reason is I think it hews in very closely to a lot of a lot of the ideas in the book, but also I mean, something I was thinking about while I was reading this was the phrasing of post-Pasteurian. Because if you're talking about like a wild, uninoculated, biodiverse fermentation, you could call that pre-Pasteurian. But like with the phrasing of post-Pasteurian, it kind of hypothesizes like a future that's not, maybe sterilized stainless steel Star Trek space stuff, but actually, not that we can ever return to the past, but a future where we do actually, hold hands with nature in a way.
Well, I mean, this is, I think, the significance of the idea of post-Pasteurian is like, okay, I mean, pre-Pasteurian, you're just doing it the way you learned how to do it, but you don't really have ideas about like biodiversity or anything like that. Whereas like post-Pasteurian, you're going into it with a fundamental understanding of microbiology and the fact that, all plants and all animal products are inhabited by these complex communities of organisms. And so you're going into it informed by Pasteur and microbiology, but you're putting your money on microbiology. You're working with it rather than seeing, sort of nature as this sort of dangerous force, which, has to be tamed and overcome, dominated. And I think that, this really gets into a lot of, a lot of like our ideologies, about, dominating other people, dominating other cultures.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I just thought of something, and then when I drank that, my brain switched from one task to another. Well, so like, I guess we're getting towards the Q&A time. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like me to ask you or you'd like to talk about?
No, let's see what other people want to talk about. I mean, I feel like this theme is it's really broad. One of the things that makes it fun for me to just talk to, different people about it is just see, what my book made people think about. And it's not that the book isn't about food, because it does keep on coming back to, the phenomenon of fermentation and other aspects of food, but it's sort of just trying to explore how these things are connected to all kinds of broader social, cultural, political things that are going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, cooking and eating are like the two things, as individuals we might think of first when it comes to food, but like none of it comes without like giant systems stretching back, in some cases, billions of years, if you include evolution.
Well, I think you have to include evolution, because I would say that, fermentation, the transformative action of microorganisms, sort of produced oxygen, enabled, oxygen-loving organisms such as ourselves to exist, and really, have driven a lot of, evolutionary change.
Yeah, I mean,
even before our current foods existed, before we existed, and could sort of like learn from nature how we could, transform our foods.
Should we start some Q&A?
Yeah.
Sure.
Great. Thank you, Arielle, so much for leading that conversation.
Oh, well, it was
so much.
Very much a co-driven effort, I think. Thanks, Sandor.
Absolutely. And thank you, Sandor. Okay, well, I'm curious about this first question, which is just, what about fermentation and sexuality? That sounds intriguing. I would
Well,
agree.
one interesting thing that I found, when I looked up fermentation in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first recorded figurative use of the word fermentation, according to the OED, was in a Bible commentary, but it was referring to a young man at the height of his bubbly fermentations. So, it was really sort of suggesting sexuality. But I mean, I think sexuality is very, it's a realm of our lives where, where people get very, very bubbly. And so, I mean, I think that we can apply the concept of fermentation to all kinds of things. And, I mean, various, artistic and cultural movements, political movements, but also, I think that I think it applies really well to our sexuality. And I also have a section in there talking about emotional composting. And I think, even our emotion, thinking about how people process their emotions. I think, I mean, compost is a beautiful image, fermentation more broadly, the idea of, fermentation breaks down forms and creates new ones. And so, that's a good way to think about, how we process emotions and all kinds of things, but definitely sexuality.
Well, and I like how you tied that to gender and neurodiversity as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that
sure.
concept. And it makes me just think of like empathy and nurturing, like how everyone was talking about their sourdough starters, like at the beginning of the pandemic, and like naming them and taking care of them. And like there was this like need to, engage with other people and humans, but like all they had was sourdough. So they just channel their energy into that because it was like sort of, I mean, it's living. Okay, I'll let you talk. This is from Rahel. Is fermentation a global phenomenon? Not so much today, but historically, did it evolve independently in cultures all around the globe?
Well, I mean, I would say definitely fermentation is most definitely a global phenomenon. And I mean, it's hard to say in every case, like what arose independently in a given place and what did people learn about from, their contacts with other people and cross-cultural influence. But, it certainly seems clear to me that fermentation traditions arose, on every inhabited continent. And, I have not really been able to find any examples of culinary traditions that do not incorporate fermentation. And, I mean, I have met people who are descended from traditions which have just been like disrupted, or an entire population moved, or sort of government policies to try to sort of destroy their culture. And sometimes people in those situations like don't know of any fermentation traditions in their particular tradition. But, in every region of the world, there are clear examples of ferments that have developed. And there's always been, there's always been even before, globalization, there always have been cross-cultural influences. And, fermentation is one of those things that, people over time have influenced each other. Like, I mean, we would think of sauerkraut as like a German word, an Eastern European food, but all of the historical stories about sauerkraut suggest that it comes from China, and that it was nomadic people of Central Asia that sort of brought the idea of fermenting vegetables underneath a brine, westward into Europe. But I think that happened, in ancient times. So it's hard to say exactly what arose independently where and what arose via influences. When I was in Costa Rica a few years ago, my host took me to meet this indigenous group called Bribri people on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica. I understood koji to be, koji and its relatives to be a phenomenon of Asia. But you know, in this tradition, they're like making a corn mash, wrapping it in leaves and letting it get all moldy for 5 days, and then making a chicha out of it. So,
very cool.
you know, I don't know if there was some like long ago forgotten Asian influence or whether this idea arose independently there. And then just a few weeks ago, a Brazilian researcher sent me an article that he wrote that throughout the Amazon, people were growing molds on cassava as part of the processing of it. So, you know, so I think maybe a lot of these ideas really did arise independently in different places through people's clever skills of observation and analysis.
But I mean, I think you could like conceive theoretically, like, you know, in deep human history, of a situation where like you hunt an animal and you have some meat, or maybe you like pick a bunch of fruit and like maybe bury it under some stones to save for later, and that would just ferment naturally that way. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's like entirely.
But if you're picking a bunch of fruit, you're already noticing that some of them are fermenting.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, it's just the fact of picking fruit, you're encountering fermentation. What you make of that, you know, you know, it's not a foregone conclusion, but
Right.
like, you know, you eat 100 berries and some of them are going to be already fermenting.
Mm-hmm. More
Cool.
fun, the fun berries and the, yeah.
Okay. How do you think COVID will affect the overall perspective of the microscopic? Do you think people will think bacteria are more scary since the clarity between viruses isn't clear, or do you think there will be more understanding to the power of small things? Excellent question.
Well, I mean, I certainly hope that COVID doesn't make people decide that the entire world of microorganisms is their enemy. You know, I mean, you know, I mean, illnesses have just been a repeated part of you know, of human life, and it doesn't in any way diminish the importance of bacteria in our bodies, in our lives, the you know, importance of, you know, all these different kinds of microorganisms in maintaining ecological balances. And, you know, I just think that we can't afford to think of a form of life as our enemies. Sure, okay, this particular virus is creating huge problems for us. That doesn't mean that viruses in general are our enemies, and we need to develop a technology to eradicate all viruses, because as I understand it, you know, these viruses called phages, which attack bacteria and are thought to be the most new, if you consider a virus a life form, the most numerous life form on the earth, you know, they do a lot to help maintain ecological balances. And like in our bodies, they're one of the forces that are protecting bacteria that might potentially be able to make us sick from doing so. So, I mean, I just think we have to, you know, we have to think beyond like the individual sensationalized organisms, whether it's the ones that create problems for us or the ones that are really good for us, and really recognize that the bigger issue is the, you know, the totality and the relationships. And you know, I think if, you know, if we decide to, let's say, target all viruses, you know, we'll just create way bigger problems than we solve.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Jen. This is from Catherine. Fermentation has played a major role in defining regional cultures. As our world becomes more of a melting pot, how do you feel fermentation plays a role in defining cultures moving forward, particularly as various traditions of fermentation are now being borrowed back and forth?
Well, I would, you know, just like I told the story of like sauerkraut, I mean, it's not like fermentation traditions just have started getting borrowed back and forth now. I mean, I think that there's just, you know, it's just, you know, throughout all the ages of migration and cultural mixing, that's been one of the, you know, aspects of culture that's in the mix.
I think the Rachel Laudan book, Cuisine and Empire, is a great delve into that concept of how food has traveled in the past with the movement of like peoples and governments. Sorry, not to interrupt your.
No, it's great. No, I'm happy to hear your perspectives as well, Arielle.
Okay.
You know, and I would just say, I mean, I think that, you know, I just was having a conversation with someone about how, you know, accents are becoming less, you know, regional accents are becoming less pronounced. And, you know, there's certain processes, you know, I mean, people's worlds got bigger. You know, I mean, you know, easy transportation, television, the internet, all of these things, you know, make the reach of individual people's lives much bigger, and the influences that are possible bigger. So like, I mean, you know, until, you know, when I started playing around with this, like, you know, it was possible to find koji in the US, but it was not easy. I mean, the first time I tried to buy koji from the South River Miso Company, they were so amused that somebody wanted to make their own miso that they just sent it to me as a gift. You know, and now there's all these people who are making koji, and people, you know, Jeremy Umansky and Rich Shee are like, you know, growing koji on pork chops and on chickens, and, you know, like all these, you know, crazy applications that are very, you know, a departure from the tradition. But I mean, personally, I don't think that that's bad. I mean, I recognize the potential for people to feel like their culture has been, you know, taken from them. But I mean, I also, you know, I've heard a lot of people who are like, you know, just excited to see the sort of like innovation and you know, what a fresh perspective can bring to an ancient process. So, I mean, I think, you know, I'm really interested in all of these like regional food traditions, and I mean, even like vegetables and seasonings. I mean, you know, there's so many plants, there's so many things that people eat that haven't been globalized. I mean, I think that there are a lot of regional food traditions that persist, but I think that there are also a lot of regional food traditions that are rapidly disappearing as, you know, sort of people come under the spell of globalized food, and marketing makes them, you know, feel like they, you know, they'd rather eat, you know, some product that they saw on television than, you know, sort of what their grandparents are cooking and eating. And, you know, and to me that this is sad. I mean, I don't have an antidote for it, you know, other than, you know, celebrating, you know, the diversity of regional food traditions, and, you know, trying to get people interested in, like, you know, using different vegetables than the, you know, 5 vegetables they're used to eating. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is a you know, a huge issue.
Thank you. So I'm just going to combine 2 questions that I saw for both of you. Do you have a favorite microorganism and why? And then what is the most difficult fermentation process you've ever come across? Or I guess, like, what is your favorite fermentation?
Well, I mean, I don't have a favorite microorganism. I mean, I love lactic acid bacteria. I mean, many of my favorite foods involve lactic acid bacteria. But, you know, I think that the real magic comes from biodiversity, and it's not from singular organisms. So I really don't have a favorite microorganism. I mean, in terms of beauty and photographing them, you know, Rhizopus and Aspergillus are both, you know, sort of gorgeous fungal structures, but, you know, I wouldn't say that like one of them is my favorite. And favorite fermented food is like, it's just always so hard for me. I mean, you know, I'm very devoted to fermenting vegetables. Here's some hot sauce I made yesterday, you know, chili and salt. That's all that's in it. You know, I'm very, I mean, that's what I do most frequently in my kitchen. But I mean, I love cheese. I love beer. You know, I don't know if I love sauerkraut more than I love cheese and beer. And I just love all these interesting things that I've been learning about. Like, you know, I told you I'm doing all this like sort of recipe development for a new book that I'm working on that'll be out next year. So there's this South American ferment of cassava, yuca podrida, which translates literally to rotten cassava. But it's so good. Like I've made it like a half a dozen times in the last 2 months because it's just so delicious. So I mean, for me, you know, my enchantment with fermentation, like part of it is the diversity of the processes, and it's not that there's like one singular food. I'm chasing the sour pickle of my youth. I mean, this summer I made a lot of sour pickles, and I love eating them. But you know, I'm really enraptured by just the diversity of, you know, fermented foods and beverages. And that's what keeps me trying to like learn more about this and share more about this. Arielle, you must have.
Oh yeah,
favorites.
I also, I can't, I mean, they're just can't possibly pick a favorite. One that I just think is neat would be Zygosaccharomyces reuxii, which is a salt-tolerant yeast that you often find in soy sauce fermentations. Okay. And I mean, I like it because it's salt tolerant, so that's a cool thing. But it has some like interesting metabolic features where it creates, you know, just as a byproduct of the fermentation, flavor molecules that taste like roasted caramel malty things, and they're actually some of the same molecules that you would get by like roasting or toasting something. That would happen through the Maillard reaction, but this particular yeast just makes them like for fun. So I think that's neat. Yeah.
Cool.
And
and do you want to say your favorite fermented food?
Oh, was it favorite or hardest?
Both.
Oh, well, so one I have not seen firsthand, but I would like to. There's a very, very interesting, like very complex fermentation to get that takes you from like rice or sorghum or other grains to the distilled spirit baijiu. So it's like baijiu it's Chinese. It's like actually by volume the most popular alcohol in the world. And the starter process is a little bit like koji. There's molds involved, but there's a lot of like fascinating stuff with like pit fermentations and, you know, adding some things at some times, and some parts of it have been going for like 200 years. I don't fully understand it, but I would really like to get into the pit if I would be allowed to. But really neat thing.
And in terms of hardest fermentations, I mean, I guess what I would say is, you know, if you're going to experiment, you're going to have failures. And so, you know, the hard fermentations have been, you know, the ones where, you know, I had a failure or 2 or 3. You know, beyond that, it's just like some things involve a lot of different steps. But you know, generally each step is not that difficult. When I was trying to make Mao tofu, which Mao tofu is like tofu with this hairy mold growing on it, and markets all around China, you see it, and it's like the first step of making what's generally called furu, which is like pickled tofu, fermented tofu. But usually people buy at the market the Mao tofu, and then they dip it in alcohol and add whatever kinds of seasonings they're going to add. But when I was trying to make Mao tofu just based on written descriptions, and they all said rice straw, and I mean, nobody in Tennessee grows rice, so I couldn't find rice straw, but I was trying it on rye straw and on wheat straw and on pumpkin leaves, and I kept getting like bright red, bright orange molds. And, you know, while I encourage people not to throw away their sauerkraut if a little bit of white hairy mold grows on the top of it, just skim it off. Like, bright colored molds scare me, and I'll just throw anything out that develops a bright colored mold like that. So that was hard until I found a starter culture. And then I've had great results with making Mao tofu with the starter culture.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandor. We should wrap up. We've gone over a few minutes. So thank you everyone for letting us do that. I mean, certainly we could keep going, and I wish that we could. Just quickly, someone in the chat commented about like supporting local bookstores, and I just wholeheartedly agree. And sorry, I just threw those Amazon links. It's just the quickest thing that happens when you Google, but I absolutely encourage you to just, I wrote it there so you could have the titles and then go buy the books at your independent local bookstore that you want to support. We partnered with Greenlight Bookstore in Brooklyn on this event. And so for those of you that bought the book with your ticket, that's who is fulfilling those orders for you. So absolutely go out there and keep supporting your local bookstores. And thank you so much for making that note. And I will send you a follow-up email tomorrow with links for all of Sandor's books so you can find them. And Arielle has a book coming out. Tell us when?
In a while.
In a while. We can't wait. Do you know the title of your book?
It's going to be called Flavorama: The Unbridled Science of Flavor and How to Get It to Work for You.
So exciting. So congratulations. Cannot wait for that. And I will send you some more book suggestions because I know some of you are asking for more fermentation resources. And maybe Sandor, Arielle, if you want to like send me some ideas tonight, I can throw that in the email tomorrow for everyone.
Let me just throw out my website, wildfermentation.com. And if you go to fermentation links in there, I just, whenever I come across a, interesting fermentation resource, I put it in my fermentation links. So, you could think of my website as a portal to those things, but, there's a lot of fermentation resources out there in the world.
Perfect.
And it's interesting. So people putting together all kinds of great information.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. So I'll also include that in the email, and definitely big shout out to, our friend Jeremy Umansky, Koji Alchemy. He did a program with us a couple months ago. You can watch that program through the MOFAD site too. So I'll send you that as well. So thank you guys so much. Thank you all for staying with us tonight and having this wonderful conversation. It was a much needed distraction from this hellfire of a world we are currently living in. So thank you. Sandor, Arielle, appreciate it. I'll send the social media handles for everyone tomorrow so you can keep following everyone. And please just continue staying safe, wearing your masks, get out there and vote, and come to more MOFAD programs. So we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.